October 6, 1973, the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur. Israeli citizens are observing the holiest day of their calendar when air raid sirens suddenly pierce the silence. Egypt and Syria have launched a surprise attack. The Yom Kippur War has begun. But what follows in the coming days will change not just the Middle East, but the entire global economy. 2 weeks into the conflict, Arab oil producers announce a radical move: an oil embargo against the United States and other nations supporting Israel. The price of oil quadruples almost overnight. Gas stations across America run dry. Long lines of cars stretch for blocks. The American economy, so dependent on cheap oil, plunges into recession. This wasn't just an energy crisis. It was a seismic shift in global power, demonstrating how control over a single resource, oil, could reshape international relations and bring the world's most powerful nation to its knees. The 1973 oil shock remains one of history's most dramatic demonstrations of a fundamental truth. Energy isn't just about powering our homes and vehicles, it's about power itself. Welcome to the geopolitics of oil and energy, the high-stakes intersection of geography, resources, technology, and international relations that has shaped our modern world and continues to drive global conflicts and alliances today. Our story truly begins in August 1859, when an American entrepreneur named Edwin Drake struck oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania. Drake's well, the first commercial oil well in the United States, seemed modest at the time, producing just 25 barrels of crude oil per day. Yet it sparked an industry that would transform human civilization. Within a few decades, oil would replace coal as the world's most strategic resource. By the turn of the 20th century, oil was already becoming crucial for military power. In 1911, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the British Admiralty, made the fateful decision to convert the Royal Navy from coal to oil power. The switch gave British warships greater speed and range, but it also made Britain dependent on oil imports, primarily from Persia, modern-day Iran. As Churchill himself noted, safety and certainty in oil lie in variety and variety alone. This strategic vulnerability led Britain to establish the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later British Petroleum, or BP, and effectively take control of Persian oil resources. This pattern, great powers securing access to oil through a mix of corporate investment, diplomacy, and sometimes military force, would become a recurring theme in 20th century geopolitics. During World War I, oil proved decisive. German General Erich Ludendorff later wrote, "We were not sufficiently supplied with oil, and this deficiency crippled all our enterprises." The Allied powers, with their access to American and Middle Eastern oil, maintained a crucial advantage throughout the conflict. The interwar period saw a growing recognition of oil's strategic importance. In 1928, the world's largest oil companies, Standard Oil of New Jersey, later Exxon, Royal Dutch Shell Anglo-Persian Oil Company, BP, and several others, secretly met at Achnacarry Castle in Scotland to form what became known as the Maaziz Agreement, or the Achnacarry Agreement. This cartel effectively divided the global oil market among themselves, establishing quotas and fixing prices to maintain their dominance and profitability. World War II once again demonstrated oil's military significance. Japan's decision to attack Pearl Harbor in 1941 was driven partly by American oil sanctions that threatened to strangle the Japanese economy and military. Adolf Hitler's desperate drive toward the Caucasus oil fields in 1942 reflected Germany's critical fuel shortages. And when Allied bombers strategically targeted German synthetic fuel plants in 1944, they effectively grounded the Luftwaffe and immobilized Nazi tank divisions. American geographer and presidential advisor Isaiah Bowman observed during this period that whoever controls the world's oil resources controls the world. This maxim guided much of American foreign policy in the post-war era. The Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union played out partly as a competition for access to and control of global energy resources. In 1953, the CIA orchestrated a coup against Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after he nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The coup reinstated the pro-Western Shah and returned Iranian oil to Western control, a short-term success that would have long-term consequences when anti-American revolutionaries overthrew the Shah in 1979. Meanwhile, a new player was emerging in the global oil game. In 1960, representatives from Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Venezuela met in Baghdad to form the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. Initially created as a counterweight to the power of Western oil companies, OPEC would transform over the next decade into one of the most influential economic organizations in history. The 1973 oil embargo, which we touched on at the beginning, marked OPEC's emergence as a geopolitical force. In the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, Arab oil producers, led by Saudi Arabia's King Faisal, weaponized their control of oil supplies to punish Western supporters of Israel. The embargo quadrupled oil prices from roughly 3 to 12 per barrel and demonstrated the vulnerability of oil-importing nations. U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger responded with what became known as petrodollar recycling, a complex arrangement whereby Saudi Arabia and other oil producers would price oil in U.S. This system, which remains largely in place today, helped cement the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency, and created a symbiotic relationship between U.S. financial power and Middle Eastern oil wealth. The 1970s also saw the emergence of a concept known as the resource curse, or the paradox of plenty. Political economists observed that many countries rich in natural resources, particularly oil, often experienced slower economic growth, greater corruption, and more authoritarian governance than countries without such resources. As economist Jeffrey Sachs put it, resource-rich economies often do not grow faster than resource-poor economies, and often grow more slowly. Resource wealth often leads to inequality and various forms of social division. This pattern was evident across the oil-producing world, from Nigeria and Angola to Venezuela and Iraq. Oil revenues flowed to ruling elites, enabling them to maintain power through patronage networks and security forces while neglecting broader economic development. As political scientist Michael Ross later documented, oil wealth tended to impede democracy by enabling governments to fund themselves without taxing citizens, removing a key mechanism of accountability. The geopolitics of oil took another dramatic turn in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution. When Ayatollah Khomeini's Islamic revolutionaries overthrew the pro-American Shah, Iranian oil production plummeted. Global oil prices more than doubled, triggering another global energy crisis and recession. The subsequent Iran-Iraq War, 1980-1988, further disrupted Middle Eastern oil supplies as the two oil giants attacked each other's energy infrastructure and targeted tankers in the Persian Gulf. The United States responded by deepening its military commitment to the Persian Gulf region. In 1980, President Jimmy Carter articulated what became known as the Carter Doctrine. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America, and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force. This doctrine underlaid America's military involvement in the region for decades to come, including the 1991 Gulf War, when the United States led a coalition to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait after Saddam Hussein's invasion threatened Saudi Arabia and global oil supplies. The late 20th century also saw the emergence of the concept of energy security as a core national interest. In a 1988 article, political scientist Daniel Yergin defined energy security as the assurance of sufficient energy supplies to permit national economies to function in an acceptable manner. For oil-importing nations like Japan, which relied on imports for nearly all its energy needs, this meant maintaining good relations with suppliers and diversifying sources. For exporters like Saudi Arabia and Russia, it meant securing reliable markets and transportation routes. The dawn of the 21st century brought new dimensions to energy geopolitics. The September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, perpetrated primarily by Saudi nationals, highlighted the complex relationship between oil wealth and political extremism in the Middle East. The 2003 Iraq War, while not solely about oil, certainly took place in a context where Iraq's vast reserves, the world's second-largest proven reserves at the time, were a significant strategic factor. As journalist Thomas Friedman observed, "The hidden hand of the market will never work without a hidden fist. McDonald's cannot flourish without McDonnell Douglas, the designer of the F-15. In other words, American economic interests in regions like the oil-rich Middle East were ultimately backed by American military power." The mid-2000s saw the peak of a theory known as peak oil, the idea that global oil production would soon reach its maximum rate and then begin an irreversible decline, leading to ever-rising prices and potential energy scarcity. Prominent geologists like M. King Hubbard had predicted this scenario since the 1950s. By 2008, when oil prices hit a crazy $147 a barrel, it looked like their predictions were really on point. But something unexpected happened. Technological innovations, particularly hydraulic fracturing or fracking and horizontal drilling, unlocked vast new oil and gas reserves in the United States that had previously been considered uneconomical. Between 2008 and 2018, U.S. oil production more than doubled, from about 5 million barrels per day to over 12 million, making America once again the world's largest oil producer. This shale revolution dramatically altered global energy geopolitics. The United States became less dependent on Middle Eastern oil, potentially reducing its strategic commitment to the region. Russia, whose economy and global influence depended heavily on oil and gas exports, faced a new competitor in global energy markets. And Saudi Arabia, seeing its market power threatened, engaged in a price war to try to drive higher-cost U.S. producers out of business. Energy geopolitics has also been transformed by growing awareness of climate change and the carbon emissions associated with fossil fuels. The 2015 Paris Climate Agreement saw nearly 200 nations commit to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, implying a long-term transition away from oil, natural gas, and coal. This energy transition creates both geopolitical risks and opportunities. For countries heavily dependent on fossil fuel exports, like Russia, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and Nigeria, the prospect of declining demand threatens economic and political stability. Russian President Vladimir Putin, whose regime relies on oil and gas revenues for roughly 40% of its federal budget, has particular reason for concern. As energy analyst Thane Gustafson put it, "The twilight of the petroleum era confronts the Russian leadership with the necessity of planning for a post-petroleum future, something it has so far failed to do." At the same time, the shift toward renewable energy sources like solar, wind, and batteries creates new resource dependencies and potential flashpoints. China, for instance, has established dominance in processing rare earth minerals essential for many clean energy technologies. In 2010, during a maritime dispute with Japan, China briefly cut off rare earth exports to its neighbor, demonstrating how these materials could be weaponized just as oil has been. The clean energy transition also raises new questions about energy security. Wind and solar power eliminate fuel dependencies but create new vulnerabilities related to critical minerals, technology supply chains, and cybersecurity for increasingly digital energy systems. Recent events have underscored how energy remains central to global geopolitics. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 led to the most significant energy crisis in decades, as Western sanctions on Russian energy exports and Russian gas cutoffs to Europe drove energy prices to record levels and forced a rapid restructuring of global energy flows. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz called this moment a Zeitenwende, a historic turning point, as Germany and other European nations that had spent decades deepening their energy ties with Russia suddenly found themselves scrambling to secure alternative supplies. Meanwhile, China has made energy central to its Belt and Road Initiative, financing oil and gas pipelines, coal plants, and renewable energy projects across Asia, Africa, and beyond. This energy diplomacy extends Chinese influence while securing access to resources, a classic strategy in the geopolitics of energy. Looking ahead, energy geopolitics will continue to evolve as the global energy mix changes, but certain fundamentals remain. Control over energy resources and technologies confers economic advantage and geopolitical leverage. Energy dependencies create vulnerabilities that strategic competitors may exploit, and secure access to energy remains essential for military power and economic prosperity. As we navigate this complex landscape, we would do well to remember the words of former U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney, who as CEO of Halliburton in 1999 observed, "The Middle East, with two-thirds of the world's oil and the lowest cost, is still where the prize ultimately lies." While the specific regions and resources may change over time, the prize of energy security and the strategic advantages it confers will continue to shape global politics for decades to come. In a world increasingly concerned with sustainability and climate change, yet still fundamentally dependent on reliable energy supplies, the geopolitics of energy will remain a defining feature of international relations, where conflicts erupt, what alliances form, and ultimately, how power is distributed across our interconnected planet.
We've got some amazing content coming your way. Subscribe now so you're first in line for fresh insights and all the good stuff you won't want to miss.